Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Jonathan Blake was a man whose life moved like clockwork. He rose each morning before the sun spilled its light over the rooftops of Acadia, his wristwatch ticking with the rhythm of his mind. Precise, rigid, intentional. He liked things neat, the lines on his shirt, the creases on his trousers, the arrangement of the toothbrush and toothpaste on the counter. Even his love had been organized. When he met Emily in Ibadan 3 years before, it wasn't love at first sight, it was calculation at first glance. She was petite, polite, with a voice soft enough to lull a crying baby, and a laugh that never came too loud. She wore Ankara skirts to church, worked as a nursery teacher, and had dreams so small and quiet, you had to bend your ear to hear them. Jonathan saw her and thought, yes, a woman who will fit my world like a hand fits a glove. It wasn't that she was unattractive. On the contrary, her beauty was the kind that crept up on you like the scent of warm puff, unassuming, but sweet once you noticed. What sealed it for Jonathan was how easy she was to manage. No drama, no wild ambitions, no flamboyant friends. She ticked all his boxes on paper. But papers don't prepare men for storms, and Jonathan wasn't a man who handled storms well. In the first year of their marriage, Emily tried to keep up. She cooked with the precision of a caterer, laid the bed as though a hotel inspector was due at any hour, and even began to iron Jonathan's boxers, an act he didn't notice until she stopped. At night, she would slide beside him like silence, her body curling like a comma against his, asking for closeness without words. And Jonathan, always calculating, would respond only when he had the time or the appetite. She understands, he told himself. She's not like Lagos girls. She's humble. When Emily got pregnant, it should have been a celebration. But to Jonathan, it was a disruption, an unexpected shift in his neatly folded reality. The cravings started. First bread and butter at 2 a.m., then roasted corn by 10 a.m., and worst of all, sardines. The smell filled their apartment like smoke, lingering in the curtains, in the sofa, in Jonathan's suit jackets. He began to find excuses to stay late at the office. When he did come home, he'd enter with his nose wrinkled and his mouth tight, as if the air itself had betrayed him. Emily, on the other hand, bloomed in a way that only pregnant women do, slowly, imperfectly, and with a grace that comes not from beauty, but from endurance. Her hips widened, her cheeks puffed, and her feet began to swell like overripe mangoes. She waddled now, each step careful and unsure. And though she still smiled, the light behind it flickered like a dying lantern. One afternoon, she stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom, one hand on her belly, the other tracing the lines of her new body. Jonathan walked in, glanced at her reflection, and sighed. "You're getting fat," he said flatly, as if stating the weather. Emily's eyes met his in the mirror. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She just nodded and turned away. That night, she made a goosey soup with pounded yam, and he barely touched it. "Too oily," he muttered. She cleared the table in silence, her swollen fingers trembling with every plate she stacked. Jonathan didn't notice. He was on his phone, chuckling at a meme someone sent in the office group chat. Outside, the wind was picking up. A quiet warning. In the following weeks, their home turned cold, not in temperature, but in essence. The warmth that once lived in the walls, in their bed, in their morning routines, vanished like mist at sunrise. Jonathan no longer touched her, not even casually. His once frequent compliments dried up like a stream in Harmattan. He began to wear cologne to bed, a strange habit Emily noticed but never questioned. He claimed it helped him sleep. In truth, he was building a life apart, even as they still shared the same roof. Emily spent her nights alone in the living room, humming lullabies to the child growing inside her. She began to write letters to her unborn daughter, letters filled with hopes she was too afraid to voice aloud. "I hope you're kind," she wrote. "I hope you don't give your heart to someone who will hold it like a wet cloth carelessly." She wrote when Jonathan was asleep, or pretending to be. During the day, she kept herself busy folding tiny clothes, choosing baby names, and drawing pictures on the back of cereal boxes. She never confronted him. Not once. She knew the man she married. And she knew deep down that he loved only the version of her that fit into his narrow frame of perfection. The new Emily, the mother Emily, was not in his blueprint. And so he began to vanish in slow, careful degrees. On the day she reached her third trimester, she found a note on the kitchen counter. Have a meeting in Abuja. Might be gone for a few days. There was no kiss. No take care. Just black ink on white paper and a wallet missing from the dresser. Emily stood there for a long time, holding the note as if it might change into something softer if she stared long enough. Then she folded it, placed it inside her Bible, and sat down. Her back ached. Her feet throbbed. But her heart was numb. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, ready to burst. She leaned back, closed her eyes, and whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for the little girl inside her. A prayer that the child would never learn to measure her worth by the weight of another's gaze. Then she rose slowly, like a woman carrying both burden and rebirth, and began to pack her hospital bag. Alone. And somewhere far away, Jonathan was already sipping whiskey in an air-conditioned hotel, convincing himself he'd done nothing wrong. The morning the contractions started, the sky in Enugu was a colorless dome, the kind that hinted at rain but held back as if watching to see who would break first. Emily sat by the window of her sister's flat in Independence Layout, breathing through the dull ache twisting in her lower back. Her hospital bag was packed already, sitting near the door like a silent companion that knew its time had come. Her sister, Titi, was in the kitchen boiling water and mumbling about traffic and hospital queues. Jonathan hadn't called in days. Not a text. Not even the courtesy of a message to ask if she was still alive. The last she'd heard from him was a transfer notification of 50,000 naira. No note attached, no explanation. Just money, dropped like breadcrumbs from someone fleeing the forest. Emily knew better than to expect more. The man who once kissed her forehead after dinner now treated her like a tenant he regretted renting to. She moved slowly toward the chair, clutching the edge of the wall for support, breathing through the contractions that came in waves. Pain carved its initials across her spine, each surge sharper than the last. The sound of boiling water from the kitchen hissed like a warning. She told herself not to cry. She would not break before the baby arrived. Not now. By the time they reached the hospital, her water had broken and soaked through her wrapper. Titi was driving like a woman possessed, screaming at Okada riders who got too close and cursing the potholes that seemed to conspire against them. Emily, bent over in the back seat, clenched her teeth through each contraction. Her hands searched for something to grip, door handle, seatbelt, anything to anchor her to the world as pain threatened to toss her away. The hospital was crowded, the air thick with sweat and antiseptic. Nurses hurried past with clipboards. The receptionist barely looked up as they wheeled Emily in on a rusty wheelchair. A doctor, young and too casual for Emily's liking, asked her name and gestation week with all the emotion of someone ordering umla. As they rolled her into the maternity ward, the storm outside finally broke. Thunder cracked like a whip across the sky, and the rain fell in heavy sheets against the window panes. Emily closed her eyes and let the pain take her. She screamed only when necessary, not because she was brave, but because she'd run out of energy to scream. Each wave of pain was a door creaking open, and somewhere at the end of that corridor was her daughter, her reason. After 6 hours that felt like 6 lifetimes, Lily was born just after midnight. She didn't cry immediately, which sent a spear of panic through Emily's chest. But then came the sound, a wail so strong it filled the room like a hymn. Emily wept, not from pain, but from something deeper, something sacred. She held Lily to her chest, skin to skin, and felt a love that no man could ever earn or steal. The nurses congratulated her with soft smiles and tired eyes. They cleaned the blood and sweat from her skin, changed her sheets, and placed Lily in the small plastic crib beside the bed. The storm had passed, but the smell of rain still hung in the air, fresh and wet and promising. Emily stayed awake all night. Her body ached in places she didn't know existed, her legs felt like borrowed wood, and her eyes stung from exhaustion. But her heart pulsed with a strange peace. A peace that came not from certainty, but from clarity. She knew she was alone now. There would be no husband pacing the hallway, no proud father posing with the baby for Facebook likes. But she had Lily, and Lily had her. That was enough. In the morning, she turned on her phone. Still no message from Jonathan. Not even a missed call. She stared at the blank screen for a long time before placing the phone face down on the bedside table. Titi arrived with jollof rice wrapped in foil and a thermos of hot tea. She kissed Lily, complimented her cute little nose, and rubbed Emily's back gently. "You did well," she whispered. Emily nodded but didn't reply. Her words had gone somewhere far and quiet. Everything she wanted to say now lived inside her drawings and in the lines on Lily's face. She stared at her daughter and silently promised to become the kind of woman Lily would never have to heal from. The discharge papers came 3 days later. Emily dressed slowly, folding each baby cloth with precision, placing every item back into the bag like it was part of a ritual. Titi held Lily while Emily cleaned up. She looked at herself in the mirror for the first time since delivery. Her eyes were sunken, her hair tied up in a tangled scarf, and her belly still round, as if it hadn't gotten the memo. She looked nothing like the girl Jonathan had married. But what stared back at her from the glass wasn't broken. It was raw, honest, reborn. She walked out of the hospital with her head held high, Lily pressed against her chest in a sling. The world outside had resumed its noise, buses honking, hawkers shouting, motorcycles weaving through traffic. But Emily moved through it with the quiet confidence of someone who had bled and survived. They returned to Titi's flat, and for the first time in weeks, Emily slept soundly, without dreams, without dread. In the days that followed, she woke early, sang lullabies while washing Lily's clothes by hand, and began sketching again. Her drawings had changed. They were softer now, more emotional. Mothers with heavy eyes, children wrapped around their waists, rain falling in the background. She didn't share them with anyone. Not yet, but the act of drawing was its own healing. Jonathan didn't call, and she didn't chase him. There was nothing left to beg for. His silence had spoken louder than any insult. And besides, Lily's coos filled the silence just fine. The flat in Abaddon was small, just 2 rooms and a narrow corridor with faded walls and a bathroom that groaned with rust each time the tap coughed out water. But for Emily, it felt like a fortress carved out of her own will. Her sister had helped her settle in the month after Lily's birth, but by the time the baby turned 6 weeks old, Emily insisted on being alone. She wanted to learn how to build her rhythm without leaning on anyone's shoulder. The nights were the hardest, nights when Lily refused to sleep, when her cries echoed endlessly against the tiled floor, bouncing off the cracked ceiling like sorrow that refused to stay still. Emily would walk the length of the corridor in her wrapper, shushing, rocking, singing lullabies in broken rhythms. Her arms burned. Her back ached. But her resolve held firm. She didn't have the privilege of choosing ease anymore. Everything now came in the shape of survival. In the silence that followed the dawn, when Lily finally slept and the city still hadn't woken up, Emily would make herself a cup of milky tea and sit by the window, sketchbook in her lap, pencil in hand. She drew with the desperation of someone clinging to the only thing they hadn't lost. Her art shifted from fantasy to truth, scenes of barefoot mothers, rain-soaked laundry, toddlers reaching toward tired faces. She stopped pretending. She poured her new life onto paper, and in doing so, began to find a strange, tender strength between the smudged charcoal lines. Lily grew quickly, sprouting teeth before 9 months, and developing the stubborn curiosity of a child who knew her mother couldn't afford to blink too long. She crawled across the floor like wind on dry leaves, pulling down curtains, opening drawers, giggling like a thief that always got away. Emily learned to move with one ear always listening. She kept a pot of porridge on the stove at all times, mashed carrots in the fridge, and soft toys beside the bed to keep Lily calm at night. She rarely left the house, except for her small errands to Bodija Market, where she'd haggle for vegetables with one arm cradling Lily and the other holding her purse tight under her arm. The market women came to know her as that girl way draw children, because Emily had started offering small illustrations for stall signs in exchange for food discounts. Sometimes, she'd sketch a trader's daughter sitting on a sack of onions, or capture the sly grin of a meat seller posing with his sharpest knife. They began to ask for her. Word spread quietly. An artist who didn't charge much, but made your child look like royalty. She never told them about her degree, or about the gallery internship she gave up when Jonathan proposed. That part of her story stayed buried under the same silence where his name now lived. Her world narrowed beautifully, into colors, baby fingers, soft rain, and days that blurred into each other but still carried meaning. She started to breathe differently. Not the shallow breath of endurance, but the deeper kind, the breath that comes when pain no longer rules the heart. On a humid Tuesday afternoon in late April, while Lily was napping on a folded wrapper in the sitting room, Emily received a message from a woman named Ifioma, who had seen one of her drawings at a boutique in Ring Road. The woman introduced herself as an editor for a children's publication based in Acure, and she asked if Emily would be interested in submitting samples for an upcoming issue. Emily read the message 3 times, then once more for luck. Her hands trembled as she replied, polite but guarded, offering to send her most recent sketches. She didn't expect much. She had grown used to small hopes extinguishing themselves before they ever caught fire. But 2 weeks later, a package arrived, a printed booklet with Emily's illustrations gracing 3 full pages, and a small honorarium folded into an envelope tucked in the back. Her name was printed under the title, Art by Emily A. That night, she sat by the window again, not with tea this time, but with a bottle of malt, watching the city lights blink like cautious stars. She didn't tell Titi. She didn't call anyone. She simply let the moment sit with her, rich and slow like thick OG. There was no applause, no camera flashes, just Lily breathing beside her and a story that was quietly turning toward a new chapter. It didn't feel like a triumph. It felt like breath after drowning. That was enough. Months passed like beads sliding on a thread. Emily grew more confident, more structured. She created a weekly routine. Morning walks with Lily in a sling, afternoon drawing sessions while Lily napped, and evenings filled with soft music and quiet prayers. One day during a clinic visit for Lily's cough, Emily met a nurse named Mark who offered to hold Lily while she filled out a form. He had kind eyes, the sort that looked at people and not through them. He didn't flirt. He didn't ask for her number. He just held the baby like he'd done it 1,000 times and smiled when Lily reached for his stethoscope. Emily left the clinic thinking nothing of it. But 2 weeks later, she saw him again, this time at the pharmacy queue. He remembered her name. She didn't remember telling him. They spoke briefly. He complimented her art, said he'd seen some of her sketches at a local event in a cure. Emily blushed, surprised. Not because of the compliment, but because she had forgotten how it felt to be seen without being scanned. They bumped into each other again, and soon it stopped being coincidence. It was never romantic at first. Just a familiarity that grew like a plant in a crack, unplanned but persistent. Lily adored him. That alone was enough to let him near. Emily didn't know if she was ready. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't recoil at the idea of someone walking beside her. She didn't imagine betrayal at every kindness. And that, too, felt like a kind of healing. The city of Jos wore its coolness like a shawl, its breeze brushing against the hills and winding through narrow roads with an elegance that felt out of place in most Nigerian cities. Emily had never imagined she'd one day call it a kind of home, even temporarily. She and Lily had traveled up for a weekend art event, where she was invited to exhibit a small collection of illustrations on motherhood. She almost said no when the invitation came, thinking the journey would be too much, that Lily wouldn't handle the change, that it would stretch her budget to breaking. But Mark had offered to help. Not as a favor, and not with the subtle pressure most men applied when they thought kindness should buy them space in your life. He simply said, "You've worked hard. You deserve to show your work. Let me come along, just as a friend. For support." Emily hesitated, then accepted. In Jos, the air tasted cleaner, lighter, and the pace of things moved gently like water over stones. The event was modest but warm. Local artists, musicians with soft guitars, mothers with babies tied to their backs clapping gently while sipping zobo. Emily's illustrations caught quiet attention. People didn't rush to her booth, but they stood still once they arrived, staring longer than she expected. A few mothers even cried. One elderly woman touched a drawing of a mother breastfeeding by candlelight and whispered, "This was me long ago." Emily said nothing. She just smiled and bowed slightly, her heart full in a way it hadn't felt in years. On the final day of the event, they visited the market district before returning to their guest house. It was on that quiet walk between the fruit stalls and the spice vendors that Jonathan reappeared, though not in the way one might expect. He didn't show up in person, didn't call or text. But he arrived in the form of an old acquaintance, a former colleague of his from Lagos who spotted Emily holding Lily and walked up with the expression of someone who'd just seen a ghost. "Emily? Now you be this? Ah, it's been forever." His voice was coated in the kind of forced nostalgia people used when they wanted answers without asking questions directly. Emily greeted him with polite restraint. She knew what was coming before the man even tilted his head toward the child in her arms. "Is this?" he began. Emily nodded once. "Her name is Lily." The man laughed nervously. "Wow, she looks like Jonathan O. Have you too?" Emily's silence answered the unfinished question. Mark returned to her side just then, carrying bottled water and a small bag of oranges. The man's eyes lingered, taking inventory. There was an awkward pause before he smiled too widely and said, "Well, it was good to see you. I'll tell him I ran into you, if that's okay." Emily didn't reply. She simply adjusted Lily on her hip and turned back toward the path. That evening, as the sun melted into the mountains, she stood by the balcony of the guest house, holding Lily while Mark sat quietly on a wooden chair beside them. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The past had found its way into the present, but it no longer had the power to sting as it once did. That realization filled her chest like a breath. She didn't know she'd been holding all this time. Jonathan, on the other hand, was spiraling through a maze of his own design, though he didn't know it yet. His apartment in Port Harcourt was still stylish, decorated with glass, chrome, leather, and emptiness. He had all the comforts money could buy, but none of the warmth that made a space feel like home. After he left Emily, there was a brief surge of euphoria, the illusion of freedom. He hosted friends who toasted to new beginnings, entertained women who wore lace and smelled like magazines, and bought a new car just to remind himself that he was still winning. But time has a way of peeling back facades, especially when the soul beneath them is growing cold. The women stopped calling when they realized he was more preoccupied with control than connection. His colleagues noticed his temper thinning, his charisma dulling, like a knife that had lost its edge. He began spending longer hours at work, not because of deadlines, but because the silence of his apartment became unbearable. He scrolled through social media late at night, often pausing on profiles of fathers holding their babies or couples smiling with messy hair and morning faces. He never said it out loud, but he wondered if he had made a mistake. Not because he missed Emily, at least that's what he told himself, but because life had begun to feel like a flat surface, and he couldn't remember the last time it had felt like a hill worth climbing. He found Emily's Instagram page one Thursday evening, purely by accident, or so he claimed. He didn't follow her. He didn't even like a post. He just scrolled quietly, fingers slowing at every image of Lily, every caption that carried the undertones of a woman who had chosen peace over bitterness. There was a photo from Joss, a candid shot of Emily holding Lily while laughing, her head thrown back, Mark's hand barely visible at the edge of the frame. Jonathan zoomed in slightly. The details pricked at him like needles. The dress she wore was one he had seen her in before, back when she was pregnant, back when he told her it made her look too big. But in the photo, she looked radiant, confident, free. And Lily, his daughter, looked like joy incarnate, with cheeks round enough to pinch and eyes full of light. Jonathan put the phone down and stared at the ceiling, the hum of the AC filling the room like a whisper he couldn't quiet. Something inside him ached. Not the dramatic kind of heartbreak seen in films, but the quieter ache of someone who realized too late that they had thrown away something gentle, something loyal, something irreplaceable. But pride was a stubborn ghost. He didn't message her. He didn't ask about Lily. He just continued living like a man haunted by a future that might have been, clinging to distractions that no longer numbed him the way they used to. The days began to settle into a rhythm that neither Emily nor Mark had planned, but somehow welcomed like rain after weeks of heat. It started simply with shared errands, joint trips to the clinic, then long, winding conversations under trees at the park while Lily played with pebbles and leaves. Mark, though a man of few words, had a way of listening that made silence feel comfortable. He never tried to fix her past or unpack her pain. He sat with it, honored it, gave it room to breathe. When he spoke, his words were measured, deliberate, and rarely about himself. He asked about her drawings, not to compliment but to understand. He once told her, "Your pictures feel like prayers drawn in pencil." She never forgot that line. As the weeks turned into months, their closeness grew, not fast, not loud, but steady, like vines that twist without force around something they trust. Lily, now learning to walk, had taken to Mark with a fondness that made Emily uneasy at first. The child would stretch her hands to him without prompting, giggling with the kind of joy that belonged to children who knew who was safe. It was in the quiet moments, the ones without fanfare or declarations, that Emily found herself considering the possibility of letting him in, not as a helper, but as something more. But even then, she kept a part of herself tucked away, the part that still remembered being left in the rain. She never told Mark much about Jonathan. He had only ever asked once, during an evening they spent on her front steps after Lily had gone to sleep. The electricity had just gone out, the air heavy with the smell of kerosene and roasted maize from a distant corner. Mark had looked at her for a long time before saying, "He hurt you deeply." It wasn't a question. She nodded once, then whispered, "Yes, but not all at once." It was like small cuts over time. By the time I realized I was bleeding, I was already empty. Mark said nothing in return. He just reached out and held her hand, not in pity, but in recognition. After that night, the topic was never raised again. Emily didn't need to be reminded, and Mark didn't need to know more to respect the scars. Instead, they focused on the now, on Lily's new words, on Emily's freelance projects, and on little things like sharing pap in the morning and laughing at the way Lily scrunched her face when she didn't get what she wanted. With time, Emily began to accept that the life she had feared was gone forever had been replaced by something gentler, slower, but equally meaningful. And though she still looked over her shoulder sometimes, when Lily laughed a certain way, or when a number she didn't recognize flashed on her screen, those moments were brief. Fleeting shadows on otherwise sunny walls. Jonathan's life, by contrast, had become a slow unraveling. Not dramatic, not public, but the kind of steady decline that begins from within. On the surface, he was still the same man, good suit, clean car, successful career, but inside, he was a house losing light room by room. He had stopped attending parties and no longer answered casual calls from former flings or clients wanting to drink at bars along GRA in Port Harcourt. He had grown quieter, heavier, less sharp in meetings. His mind wandered often, especially at night when the world around him slept. The silence in his apartment felt louder than the streets outside. He had tried to distract himself, new shoes, gym membership, even a brief attempt at attending church again, but nothing filled the space that now echoed inside him. And it wasn't just regret, though that was there, thick like honey left too long in the sun. It was the realization that he had not simply lost something. He had thrown it away. With both hands. There were nights he would stare at old photos, not many, as Emily had deleted most of their digital history, but he had saved a few. One of her asleep, head resting on his chest during their first year together. Another of her laughing beside a Christmas tree, before the pregnancy changed everything. He found himself wondering what she was doing at that exact moment, and if she had already replaced him in Lily's life. The thought cut deeper than he admitted, even to himself. When he traveled to Joss on business nearly a year after he walked out of Emily's life, he had no intention of looking for her. In truth, he didn't even know she had been living there part-time. The city's air unsettled him. It was too crisp, too open, as if the hills themselves demanded honesty. After his meeting, he wandered through the central market, more out of boredom than necessity. That was where he saw her. It was the sound of a child's laughter that caught his attention first, a sharp, high giggle that rang through the air like bells. He turned, and there she was, Emily, in a flowing teal dress, hair tied up in a scarf, her hands holding a basket of tomatoes. Lily stood beside her, no longer a baby but a little girl, steady on her feet, face bright with mischief. And then Mark appeared, lifting Lily playfully into the air while Emily laughed, full-bodied and free. Jonathan froze. Everything around him faded, the traders' voices, the movement of customers, the honk of a passing Kiki. All he could hear was that laughter. All he could see was the life he was no longer part of. Emily looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was no surprise, no panic. Just recognition. Like seeing a stranger you once knew in a life you no longer belonged to. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply turned back to her child and her man, her posture unchanged, her peace undisturbed. And in that moment, Jonathan knew, not just that she had moved on, but that she had become someone he would never again be allowed to approach. The sun hung lazily over the rooftops in Ilorine, casting long amber shadows on the pavement and turning the tin roofs into glimmering mirrors. Emily adjusted the small backpack on her shoulder as she guided Lily toward a nearby fruit stand. The girl, now speaking in full sentences and correcting adults with boldness that made strangers laugh, walked with a bounce in her step, dragging a small plastic doll behind her. Emily had brought her to Ilorine to attend a book reading event hosted by a publishing house that had just released a children's story she had illustrated. It was her third project in 6 months. What started as a modest stream of freelance gigs had blossomed into steady work, then into modest recognition, and eventually into something resembling a second beginning. She didn't crave fame, nor did she chase the spotlight, but being seen, being appreciated for her gift, had healed something in her she didn't know needed fixing. Mark had encouraged her without pushing, always the one standing quietly at the edge of her victories with his sleeves rolled up and his smile full of pride. He didn't interrupt her dreams, he made room for them. They hadn't married. Not yet. Emily wasn't ready to fold her name into someone else's again, not after scraping it back from the corners Jonathan had left it in. But Mark understood that too. He never demanded, never rushed. He was patient in ways that could not be taught. And Lily? Lily called him Uncle Daddy without prompting, her voice dancing through their flat each morning like sunlight through a curtain. As they made their way down the dusty street toward the square where the event would be held, Emily spotted a man sitting alone on a bench near a roadside food vendor, holding a disposable coffee cup with both hands. Her feet faltered slightly, not from fear, but from recognition. Time hadn't changed Jonathan much physically, still well-groomed, still dressed with an air of silent competition, but something in his posture had altered. He looked like a man carved out of routine, not joy. As she neared, his eyes met hers. He blinked, and then his gaze dropped to the little girl beside her. Lily didn't notice him at first. She was too busy pointing at a tray of boiled groundnuts and asking if she could have some. But Jonathan saw her. He saw every inch of her face, her stride, her smile, and something in his throat caught like a dry bone. Emily didn't stop. She didn't slow down. But she felt the moment wrap itself around her like a sudden gust of wind. Not painful, not jarring, just real. Jonathan rose halfway from the bench, hesitated, then sat back down like someone unsure if they were still allowed to stand in the presence of something sacred. Lily tugged at her mother's hand. "Mummy, why is that man looking at us?" Emily looked down at her, smiled gently, and replied, "Just someone we used to know." It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't vengeance. It was simply the truth, soft-spoken, unshaken, final. Jonathan remained seated as they walked past him, the world carrying on around him like it had forgotten he ever held a place in it. Motorcycles zipped by. Children ran past. Vendors called out prices. But all he could hear was the echo of his own silence. He had imagined this moment before many times, but never like this. In his mind, he always envisioned regret making her softer, maybe even willing to sit and talk. Maybe to apologize for her role in the failure of their marriage. Maybe to look at him with the kind of sadness that proved she still cared. But none of that happened. There was no hesitation in her steps. No second glance. She had built a new life so full, so well anchored, that his absence had left no cracks. He stared down at his coffee, now cold and tasteless, and remembered the day he packed his suitcase and walked out. He thought she'd crumble. He thought she'd plead. He thought time would vindicate him. But time had done the opposite. Time had exposed the shallowness of his love and the depth of hers. It had shown that the body he despised had carried not just a child, but a courage he never had. And now here she was whole, radiant, and untouchable. He swallowed hard, feeling something thick and sour slide down his throat. Regret isn't always loud. Sometimes it just sits with you quietly, refusing to leave. Emily didn't mention the encounter to Mark that night. Not because she was hiding it, but because there was nothing to report. The past had walked past her like a stranger, and she had kept walking. They sat on the floor of the living room later, playing Ludo with Lily, who cheated outrageously and giggled each time she won. Mark laughed like someone who didn't need a scoreboard to know what really mattered. The room was filled with the kind of joy that didn't shout but hummed, soft and persistent. Emily looked at them, the man who chose her without conditions, the child who loved her without limits, and felt no more ghosts lurking. She had grieved her old life, shed it like skin, and stepped into this new one without needing it to be perfect. She was still tired sometimes, still afraid on certain nights, but she was not broken. She had been reshaped, and in that reshaping, she found something Jonathan never gave her, peace that didn't beg for permission. That night, as Lily drifted off to sleep between them, Emily sketched quietly in her notebook. No faces, just hands, small ones and big ones, steady ones holding shaking ones. It was her way of archiving truth. And somewhere far away, in a city still busy with ambition and loneliness, a man sat in his apartment, staring at a phone he no longer had the courage to use, wondering if the silence he left behind had grown too wide to cross. It had. Not everyone who walks away from you is your loss. Sometimes their absence is the space God clears for your peace to grow. Don't chase what discarded you. Don't beg where you were broken. Heal in your quiet. Grow in your own time. And when love returns, let it find you whole, not waiting, but living. Choose the kind of peace that doesn't ask for permission. You deserve that. May you never settle for a love that only sees you in your perfection, but abandons you in your becoming. May your heart find rest in the hands of someone who honors your growth, your scars, and your journey. May God send you the kind of companionship that doesn't just arrive, but stays. The kind of joy that doesn't shake when storms come. May your past never dim your future. May your healing be full. May your peace be permanent. And may you walk into every new season radiant, restored, and deeply loved. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.